It all began on what seemed like a normal morning, the kind of morning where the air feels fresh and the world looks calm. I walked outside to check on my Jeep parked right in front of my house. I had owned that Jeep for years, and it wasn't just a vehicle, it was a piece of my independence. It was the car that carried me through long drives after hard days at work. It was the car that took me on camping trips with my dog. It was the car that reminded me I still had freedom even when life threw challenges at me. But that morning something felt different. I noticed the lock I had placed on my gate was broken. The chain I had used for extra security was cut clean through. And then my heart dropped. My Jeep wasn't where I left it. For a moment I thought I was losing my mind. I walked around the yard trying to convince myself maybe I had parked it somewhere else, maybe I had forgotten. But no, it was gone. My chest tightened with panic and confusion until I heard voices down the street. I followed the sound, and there she was, the HOA Karen of our neighborhood, standing tall and smug with my Jeep right behind her. She was pointing at it like she had just conquered a mountain. Her face had that proud look, like she had finally won some invisible war. She had been fighting against me for months. She had harassed me about the Jeep. She said it didn't fit the neighborhood standard. She complained about how it looked too military, too rugged, too different from the shiny SUVs and luxury cars lined up along our street. Every meeting she found a reason to mention me. She called me reckless. She called me a troublemaker. She even told me once that people like me didn't belong here. But through it all, I kept quiet because all I wanted was peace. And yet here, she was taking things to another level, breaking into my property, cutting my lock, and seizing what wasn't hers. I could feel my blood boil. But at the same time, I felt this deep sadness. This wasn't just about a Jeep anymore. This was about respect, about human decency, about the constant feeling of being targeted for no reason. I walked straight up to her and asked why she had touched my vehicle. She looked me dead in the eyes and said, because it was an eyesore, and because the HOA had the right to decide what vehicles belong in this community. Her voice was sharp and filled with authority, like she was a queen ruling over the neighborhood, and we were just subjects beneath her. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't even begin to imagine, was that my Jeep wasn't just a personal vehicle. It was part of a federal police task force. I was part of a special unit tasked with handling sensitive operations, and that Jeep was equipped for that work. It wasn't a toy. It wasn't some rusted eyesore. It was a piece of government property. And in that moment, I almost pitied her because she had no idea the storm she had just unleashed on herself. I leaned against the Jeep, folded my arms, and simply told her, "You just committed a federal offense." She laughed at me like it was a joke. Her friends who had come to watch laughed too. She thought I was bluffing, but within minutes backup arrived. 3 of my colleagues in uniform walked down the street, calm, confident, their presence powerful. The neighborhood suddenly fell silent, and you could see the smile drop from her face. The same neighbors who usually sided with her began whispering behind her back. Her confidence wavered, her hands trembled, but she still tried to argue, saying it was her right as HOA president to enforce rules. But this time nobody was buying it. Not when 3 officers were standing right there, not when I stood next to the Jeep that was marked with federal insignia. She had exposed herself. She had crossed the line too far. The officers explained to her what she had done, that breaking into secured property and attempting to seize a federal vehicle wasn't just a violation of HOA rules, it was a crime punishable by law. Her face turned pale, her eyes darted from side to side as if searching for an escape. But there was none. The walls she had built around her power and control were crumbling in front of everyone. For me, it was a strange mix of emotions. I felt vindicated after months of humiliation, after being called names, after being disrespected. Finally, the truth was out. But I also felt a kind of sorrow, because it should never have come to this. It should never have taken federal intervention for someone to respect another human being, for someone to simply understand boundaries. As they escorted her back to her house, she kept mumbling about unfair treatment. She kept saying she was only doing what was best for the community, but everyone knew the truth. She wasn't protecting the community. She was feeding her ego. She was fueled by jealousy, by the need to control, by the need to make someone else feel small. And on that day, she finally learned that power abused always collapses. Later that evening, I sat on the porch with my dog, watching the sunset, my Jeep parked safely back where it belonged, and I thought about everything that had happened. I thought about how fragile respect can be in a world where people let pride blind them. I thought about how often we underestimate the battles others fight in silence, and I thought about how in the end justice has a way of finding its path, even if it takes time. The neighborhood hasn't been the same since that day. People walk by and wave now. Neighbors who once avoided me come up and chat. They admit they were afraid of her influence, afraid of being targeted next. and now they see me not as the troublemaker she painted me to be, but as someone who stood his ground with dignity. For me, the Jeep is still just a Jeep, but it has become a symbol, to a reminder that no matter how much people try to strip away your worth, no matter how many locks they cut, no matter how many times they try to shame you, the truth will always stand, and the truth will always set you free. And maybe that's what life is about, standing tall in the face of injustice, holding on to who you are even when the world tries to take it from you, and believing that when the storm clears, you will still be standing stronger than ever. So, if you've ever felt pushed around, if you've ever felt silenced or disrespected, let this story remind you that you are not alone. Let it remind you that people who use power to hurt others eventually fall. Let it remind you that your worth isn't defined by the loudest voice in the room, but by the strength of your own truth. And when I look back now, I don't see Karen's face, I don't hear her words. All I see is my Jeep shining in the sun, my dog wagging his tail beside me, and the peace that comes when justice is finally served. That day changed more than just my situation, it changed my entire neighborhood. It broke down the false walls of fear and showed everyone that courage is contagious, and once one person stands up, others will find the strength to do the same, and maybe that's the greatest victory of all. So if you're watching this and you're holding on to something painful, something unfair, something that feels like it will never change, hold on a little longer, because justice might take time, but it always comes. And when it does, it feels like breathing fresh air after a storm. Because in the end, this wasn't just about a Jeep. This was about respect, about dignity, about the simple truth that no lock, no chain, and no false authority can ever steal who you are. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real gripping stories like this, make sure you like this video and leave a comment. It really helps more people find these stories. And don't forget to share this with your friends and subscribe to my channel HD Stories for more powerful stories every day. It all began on a quiet morning in the suburbs, the kind of morning where the world feels calm and you believe nothing could go wrong. The sun was rising, golden rays spilling across the neighborhood, and for a moment I thought life had finally found its peace. I walked out to my garage, holding the keys to a car that meant more to me than just steel and wheels. It was a piece of my history, something my late father had once dreamed of owning. That morning, I was ready to bring it back to life. As I lifted the garage door, the crisp sound echoed through the street. I could already smell the oil and gasoline, the kind of smell that takes you back to long afternoons spent with my dad in his workshop. This car wasn't just a machine, it was a memory, a bond, a promise I had carried for years. But as fate would have it, peace never lasts long in a place where people feel entitled to control your every move. Because across the street, eyes were watching me. Eyes that belonged to the woman who had made my life a living nightmare since the day I moved in. The HOA Karen. She wasn't just any neighbor. She was the type of person who believed the entire block was hers to command. Every time I mowed my lawn, she had something to say. Every time I parked my truck, she called the association. And now, as I pulled the car out of my garage, I saw her marching across the street, her face red with fury, her finger already pointed like a weapon ready to fire. Before I could even understand what was happening, she started screaming. She yelled that I had stolen her car. Her voice cut through the morning air like a siren, waking up other neighbors who stepped out onto their porches. I froze for a moment, not believing the insanity unfolding before me. She claimed she had just bought the exact same car from an auction the day before, and that somehow I had broken into her property and seized it. The words stung, not because they were true, but because of the humiliation they carried. Imagine standing in your own driveway, holding the keys to your father's car, and being called a thief in front of your entire neighborhood. I tried to explain, my voice steady but filled with disbelief. I told her this was my car, that it had been in my family for years, that I had the paperwork, the history, the memories to prove it. But she wouldn't listen. She never listened. Instead, she pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling with rage, and dialed 911. The moment she said the words, "I want to report a stolen car," I felt a wave of coldness crash over me. Because in this world, sometimes it doesn't matter what the truth is. Sometimes all it takes is one loud voice to turn the world against you. Minutes later, sirens echoed down the street. A patrol car pulled up, lights flashing, and 2 officers stepped out. My heart raced, not because I was guilty, but because I knew how easily perception could become reality. I stood by the car, holding my documents in my hand, ready to defend the last piece of my father's legacy. Karen rushed toward the officers, her words pouring out like venom. She painted herself as the victim, saying she had been cheated, saying I had broken into her garage, saying I had stolen her dream. The officers turned to me, their eyes calm but cautious. One asked me to step away from the car, the other asked for my ID. My hands shook as I handed over the papers, the title, the registration, everything that tied me to that car. I could see neighbors whispering, their judgment heavy in the air. The car that had once been a symbol of pride now felt like a spotlight of shame. But the truth has a way of fighting back. One of the officers examined the documents, checking the VIN number against the car. The numbers matched. He asked me how long the car had been in my possession. I told him the story, how my father had worked on it before he passed, how it sat for years waiting for me to finish what he started, how today was supposed to be the day I finally drove it with pride. As I spoke, my voice cracked with emotion, and for the first time, I saw the officer's stern face soften. Meanwhile, Karen stood with her arms crossed, her anger boiling over as the truth began to unravel. She shouted that the system was wrong, that the paperwork was forged, that I was lying. But no matter how loud she got, her words were crumbling under the weight of evidence. The officer calmly told her that the car was mine, legally and rightfully, and that accusing me without proof was not only wrong but dangerous. For a moment, the world stood still. Karen's face turned pale, her confidence shattered. She had tried to take away something that didn't belong to her, and she failed. But even in that moment of vindication, I didn't feel victory. I felt drained, because the damage was already done. The neighbors had seen me accused like a criminal. The peace of my morning was stolen. The joy of driving my father's car for the first time was tainted by fear and humiliation. I looked at the officers, thanked them quietly, and turned back toward my garage. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to humiliate her the way she had humiliated me. All I wanted was to protect what was mine. Karen stormed off, her pride in pieces, but I didn't watch her go. I simply placed my hand on the hood of the car, the metal warm from the sun, and whispered to myself that my father would be proud. That no matter how cruel the world could be, no one could take away what truly belongs to you. The officers left, the neighbors disappeared back into their homes, and silence returned to the street. But I knew things would never be the same again. Injustice cuts deep, but sometimes it also carves out strength. That day, I realized that standing your ground doesn't always mean shouting louder. Sometimes it means holding on to the truth so tightly that no lie can pry it away. And as I finally sat behind the wheel, turning the key, hearing the roar of the engine that my father once dreamed of, I felt something powerful. I felt redemption. I felt peace. And I promised myself that no matter how many battles lay ahead, I would never let anyone take away my father's legacy again. Life will always put people in your path who try to break you, who try to strip away your dignity, who try to control your happiness. But the truth is stronger than their lies, and the spirit of hope is stronger than their hate. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought not with fists or words, but with patience, courage, and unshakable belief in what is right. And that day, as I drove down the street, the wind rushing against my face, I knew I had won something far greater than an argument. I had won back my peace. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe and share to support my channel HD, stories for more powerful real-life stories. They thought they could scare us with force. Imagine standing in your own yard when police rush in with guns drawn, all because an HOA president made one phone call. What they didn't know was my wife wasn't just any woman. She had trained an entire Navy SEAL platoon. That day, their biggest mistake was underestimating her. When my wife and I first decided to move into the neighborhood, we thought we had finally found the perfect place to settle down. The house sat near a quiet lake. The trees stood tall and green, and the air carried a kind of peace we had been chasing for years. After spending most of our lives working long hours, all we wanted was a little corner of the world where we could relax, breathe, and live without chaos. The neighborhood looked beautiful on the outside. Well-kept lawns, children riding their bikes down the street, and families chatting on porches. Everything told us we had made the right choice. We unpacked our boxes with smiles, imagining cookouts, peaceful evenings, and friendships with neighbors who seemed just as invested in this place as we were. But it didn't take long for the cracks to show. Within the first week, the HOA president knocked on our door, clipboard in hand, and a forced smile on his face. At first, I thought he was simply welcoming us to the community. Instead, he immediately began listing rules, fees, and obligations that felt more like orders than friendly advice. He talked about monthly dues, fines for small violations, and even gave us a thick handbook filled with rules about everything, from how tall the grass could grow to what color curtains were allowed to face the street. My wife and I exchanged glances, confused, but we listened politely. We wanted to fit in, not start problems. Over the next few days, his presence grew more intense. He would walk slowly in front of our home, staring at our yard as if he was searching for mistakes. One morning, he pointed out that our mailbox was the wrong shade of brown and that it needed to be changed immediately or we would face a fine. Another time, he claimed our trash bins weren't placed exactly at the angle required by the HOA guidelines. It almost seemed like he was inventing issues just to test us. At first, I tried to brush it off as him simply being strict, but the constant nagging became impossible to ignore. Through all of this, my wife stayed calm. She had a way of keeping her composure, even when someone was clearly trying to provoke her. She would thank him politely, close the door, and then sigh deeply, telling me not to let it get under my skin. But I could see it in her eyes. Her patience was wearing thin. She had dealt with people like him before, those who thrived on control, who pushed others around because they thought power gave them the right to do so. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, but I knew she was taking note of every encounter. Things escalated one afternoon when the president stormed over unannounced, pounding on our door with anger written all over his face. He shouted about late payments we didn't even owe, claiming we were violating community standards. I tried to reason with him, but he cut me off, wagging his finger and saying, "If you don't fall in line, I'll handle this my way." His words carried a sharp edge, and the look in his eyes made it clear he wasn't bluffing. My wife stood beside me, silent but steady, her jaw set as if she already knew this wasn't the end. We had moved here for peace, but what we found instead was a man who wanted control. And as much as he tried to intimidate us, he had no idea who he was truly dealing with. A few days after the heated confrontation with the HOA president, the tension finally exploded. It was a warm afternoon, and my wife was outside in the garden, kneeling by the flower beds, pulling weeds with her gloves on. I was sipping coffee on the porch when suddenly the sharp sound of sirens echoed down our quiet street. At first, I thought it must be an emergency somewhere else, but within seconds, 2 police cars screeched to a halt right in front of our house. My stomach dropped. Before I could process what was happening, the officers jumped out, weapons already drawn, shouting for my wife to put her hands up. My heart froze. In an instant, the peaceful image of her tending the garden turned into a scene of chaos and fear. Neighbors began peeking out from behind curtains and gathering on lawns, whispering in confusion, their eyes wide as they watched everything unfold. The HOA president stood across the street with his arms folded and a smug grin plastered on his face. He was enjoying the spectacle, convinced that this was the moment he would finally humiliate us and bend us to his will. My hands trembled, but my wife, she didn't flinch. Slowly, she rose to her feet, brushing dirt from her knees, and raised her hands with a calmness that stunned even me. Her voice was steady, commanding, as she addressed the officers. She asked them to explain why weapons were being pointed at an unarmed woman on her own property. There was no fear in her eyes, only authority. The same authority she had once used to train soldiers who faced real danger every day. And though the police didn't yet realize it, they were standing in front of someone far more experienced with discipline and power than they could ever imagine. The tension hung thick in the air until one officer, still holding his weapon, squinted at my wife and suddenly froze. He muttered her name under his breath, almost in disbelief. Then, lowering his gun, he stepped forward and said he recognized her. Years ago, during his early training, she had been the instructor who drilled discipline and courage into his unit. His voice carried respect, almost awe, as he explained to the others who she really was. The shift was instant. The officers lowered their weapons, their tones softening into apology. They quickly realized they had been misled by the HOA president's false claims. My wife, still calm but firm, reminded them of their duty to serve truth, not lies born out of someone's ego. The crowd of neighbors gasped and murmured, many looking at her with newfound admiration. The HOA president's smirk vanished, his face pale as he realized his plan had collapsed in front of everyone. The officers turned to him, warning that filing false reports carried serious consequences. From that day forward, the fear he once spread over the neighborhood vanished. Respect replaced intimidation, and everyone learned a powerful lesson: never underestimate quiet strength. If this story moved you, imagine the one still waiting to be told. Don't miss a single moment of justice, drama, and inspiration. Like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our family at HD Stories, where every story has the power to keep you hooked till the very end.
It started like any ordinary morning at our ranch. The sun was just beginning to rise over the fields, painting everything with a golden light, and my wife was sipping her coffee near the front porch she had just moved into this neighborhood with me. And though we both knew the HOA was strict, we had no idea how far they were willing to go. From the very first week, Karen, the self-appointed HOA watchdog, had her eyes on us. She seemed to think the entire community belonged to her. She had made little complaints about the way our curtains looked, about the way our mailbox was painted, and even about the flowers my wife planted by the fence. My wife tried to smile and ignore her because she is a woman of discipline and patience. But Karen kept pushing and pushing. That morning, the doorbell rang not once, not twice, but again and again, like someone was pounding with anger. My wife decided not to open the door because she knew exactly who it was. Karen, she had been showing up almost every day with some new demand or some new complaint. My wife had enough, and for once she chose peace and silence by not answering. But silence was something Karen could not stand. She pulled out her phone right there on our porch, yelling loud enough for half the street to hear that she was calling the cops. She screamed that my wife was refusing a lawful HOA order and that she was being threatened by us. The drama was so loud that neighbors started peeking through their blinds and stepping outside to see the chaos. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. 2 patrol cars rolled up and officers stepped out. Karen ran toward them, waving her arms like she was the victim. She pointed at our house, shouting that the woman inside was dangerous, uncooperative, and violating community law. The officers looked at each other confused, but followed her to our door. My wife finally opened it. She stood tall, calm, and steady. Her eyes locked with the officers. She asked them how she could help, and before they could speak, Karen jumped in, yelling that she was a troublemaker, a threat, and that they needed to remove her from the neighborhood right now. She even demanded that they take her in handcuffs. The officers glanced at my wife, then back at Karen, and something in their faces changed. They stepped aside respectfully, and one of them addressed my wife with a tone that Karen did not expect. "Chief, what do you want us to do here?" The street fell silent. Neighbors' mouths dropped open. Karen froze her eyes wide as the truth hit her like a brick. My wife was not just another resident in this neighborhood. She was the new chief of police. For the entire district, she had taken her post only weeks earlier and had not shared it with anyone in the HOA because she never felt the need to flaunt her position. My wife crossed her arms and looked at Karen with calm authority. She asked the officers to confirm their report, and they nodded firmly, saying, "Chief, we received a call about a hostile resident refusing orders, but it looks like the caller failed to mention the full truth." Karen tried to interrupt, insisting that she had every right as an HOA board member, but my wife stopped her with one sentence: "The HOA does not outrank the law." Crowd of neighbors that had gathered whispered in shock. Some even smiled, knowing that Karen had finally met her match. My wife reminded everyone present that no one has the right to misuse law enforcement for personal vendettas. She warned Karen that making false reports was a serious crime and that she could be charged for wasting police resources. Karen's face turned pale. She stuttered that it was just a misunderstanding, that she never meant to cause trouble. But the officers stepped forward and reminded her that every call is recorded and every false report has consequences. My wife gave her one last chance to calm down and warned her that if she ever tried to harass another resident again, the law would deal with her. Not. For the first time, Karen had no words. She backed away slowly, her arrogance replaced with fear and humiliation. The neighbors who had once felt powerless against her finally saw justice unfold right before their eyes. Some clapped quietly. Others nodded in relief. My wife closed the door behind her and returned to her coffee like nothing had happened. But the story did not end there. In the following weeks, the HOA tried to soften their stance. They suddenly sent us polite letters. They tried to hold community barbecues and pretended as if nothing had ever happened. The truth was, they were afraid of being exposed for years of overreach and intimidation, and now they knew someone strong enough stood against them. My wife never boasted. About her role, she never used her badge to scare people, but she made it clear that our home was a place of respect and fairness, and anyone trying to break that balance would face consequences. As for Karen, she was noticeably quieter her daily. Patrols around the neighborhood stopped, her angry knocks at doors ended, and the smug look on her face disappeared. Neighbors slowly started opening up to us, sharing their own stories of how Karen had bullied them in the past. One woman said she was fined for hanging her laundry outside. Another said she was threatened for leaving her trash bin out too long. The fear that once gripped the community was gone because they knew Karen had been put in her place. My wife taught me something powerful. That day, true strength is not about shouting louder or using force. It is about standing firm in the face of injustice and letting the truth speak for itself. Karen thought she had power through fear, but my wife showed everyone that real authority comes with integrity and fairness, and so our life in that neighborhood became peaceful. Not because the HOA changed overnight, but because one woman with courage and the badge of truth refused to be bullied. We still live here today with neighbors who finally smile, wave, and greet us kindly, and Karen, well, she still lives here too, but much quieter than before, knowing that every time she walks past our house, she is walking past the home of the chief. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more powerful HOA dramas and real-life twists, then make sure to like, comment, and share this video. Do not forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, HD Stories, for more gripping stories every day.
Started as one of those mornings where everything feels calm. The air was cool, the sky was clear, and I had just stepped outside with my service dog, Max. He wasn't just a pet, he was my lifeline. Max had been trained to help me with my disability, to ground me when my anxiety hit, to remind me of my medication, and to give me a sense of independence that I thought I had lost forever. Walking with him was not just a routine, it was a reminder that I wasn't broken, that I still had a chance at living a normal life. But that peaceful morning would soon turn into a nightmare that I could never forget. I had lived in this neighborhood for years, quietly, peacefully, minding my own business. Most people respected me and my dog, but there was always that one person. The kind of person who made everything difficult, who never missed a chance to complain. In our neighborhood, that person was the HOA Karen. She was loud, she was entitled, and she believed she had the right to control everything around her, including my own life. Max and I had barely walked a few steps outside my gate when I saw her storming across the grass. Her face twisted with anger, her voice sharp like broken glass. She shouted something about my dog being a danger, about him not belonging here, about how she would make sure the HOA fined me until I moved out. I tried to stay calm. I tried to explain that Max was a certified service dog, trained and protected by federal law. But before I could finish, she did something I could never have imagined. She pulled out a spray bottle from her bag and without hesitation, aimed it at Max's face. My heart stopped as I saw the stream hit him, white mist covering his eyes and nose. Max yelped and collapsed to the ground, his body twisting in pain. I screamed, rushing to him, trying to shield him with my arms. My hands trembled as I called his name, begging him to stay with me. The woman just stood there, holding the bottle, her expression cold, almost proud of what she had done. That moment broke me. Max was more than a dog. He was my family, my best friend, my lifeline. To see him treated like trash, to see him in pain because of someone's cruelty, it shattered me. I could barely breathe, my chest heavy with panic. My neighbors had started to gather, whispers turning into shouts as people pulled out their phones, recording everything. And then, the sound of sirens filled the street. The police arrived fast, faster than I expected. For officers stepped out of their cars, their expressions hardening as they saw what was happening. One officer rushed toward me, kneeling beside Max, checking if he was still breathing. Another officer stepped in front of me, raising his hand toward the woman. "Drop it now," he shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. She froze, still gripping the spray bottle. Her confidence flickered for the first time, replaced with hesitation. "What's the problem?" she tried to say, her voice trembling. "It's just a dog. A dangerous one. I was protecting the neighborhood." The officer's expression turned into something I'll never forget. Pure disbelief, then controlled fury. "This isn't just a dog," he said firmly. "This is a service animal. Harming a service animal is a federal crime." The words hung in the air like thunder. The crowd gasped, neighbors exchanging shocked looks. Karen's face drained of color. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but nothing came out. She looked around desperately, as if hoping someone would take her side, but all she saw were phones recording, eyes filled with judgment, and the reality of what she had just done crashing down around her. I held Max's head in my lap, stroking his fur, whispering to him to stay strong. His breathing was shallow but steady. The officer beside me assured me that animal control and emergency services were on their way. He told me that Max would be okay, that I had to stay calm. But inside, I was torn apart. This wasn't just about my dog being hurt. This was about dignity, respect, and the cruel way some people think they can step over others without consequences. The police moved quickly. They took the bottle from Karen's hands, reading the label. It wasn't just water. It was a harsh chemical spray meant for pests. The officer's voice grew colder as he read it aloud. The evidence was clear. She hadn't just lost her temper. She had planned this. She came ready to hurt my dog, ready to destroy the one thing that gave me freedom. As they handcuffed her, I saw the anger in her face turn to panic. She shouted that she didn't know, that she didn't mean it, that it was all a misunderstanding. But her words meant nothing now. The law was on my side. The truth was on my side. The officer explained to her, loud enough for the crowd to hear, that interfering with a service animal is punishable by heavy fines and even prison time. He said that service animals are protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that harming them is the same as harming the person they serve. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. She wasn't the one in control anymore. She wasn't the bully with the loudest voice. She was just another criminal who thought she could get away with cruelty. And now she was facing the consequences. The ambulance for Max arrived, and they carefully lifted him onto a stretcher. I followed close, refusing to let go of him. Tears streamed down my face. But for the first time that day, they weren't just tears of pain. They were tears of relief. Because Max was alive. Because justice was finally being served. The neighborhood watched silently as Karen was taken away in a police car. Some neighbors walked up to me, offering words of support. One even placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and whispered, "You're not alone anymore. We saw everything. We'll stand with you." That night, as I sat by Max's side at the emergency vet, I thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the cruelty, the injustice. But also the strength, the courage, and the hope that followed. Max would recover. The law would protect us. And the woman who tried to take away my lifeline would face the consequences of her choices. This wasn't just a story about a dog being hurt. This was a story about standing up against injustice. About how cruelty can never overpower love. About how the truth, no matter how painful, will always shine brighter than lies. Max may have been attacked, but he came out stronger. And so did I. I looked at him, his eyes slowly opening, his tail weakly wagging, and I whispered, "We made it, buddy. We're still standing. And no one will ever break us again." Sometimes, life tests you in ways you never expect. Sometimes it breaks you, only to show you how strong you really are. And sometimes, even in the darkest moments, there is light waiting to guide you forward. That light for me was Max. And no matter what happens, I will always protect him, just as he has always protected me. If you've ever felt the weight of injustice, if you've ever faced cruelty that tried to take away your hope, remember this story. Because love, loyalty, and truth will always win in the end. This is not just my story. This is Max's story. And it's a reminder to everyone watching that we must stand against cruelty, no matter how small it seems, and defend what we love with everything we have. So to anyone out there going through their own battles, remember this. You are not alone. You are stronger than you think. And no one, no matter how cruel, can take away your worth. If you felt this story, if it touched your heart, don't let it end here. Share it, talk about it, and remind others that kindness will always defeat cruelty. Because at the end of the day, we all deserve to be treated with dignity, with love, and with respect. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to Max's story, and thank you for standing with us. Please like this video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and share it with others who need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel HD, Stories for more powerful real-life stories that matter. Grandpa always said he was too old for drama, but when the HOA patrol started climbing our fence like they owned the place, something inside him snapped. He didn't call the police. He didn't argue. Instead, he cooked up a plan that would leave the patrol shaking in their boots. You won't believe what Grandpa did next and how the whole neighborhood ended up watching. And before the video starts, write in the comments which city or country you are watching this video from. It all began with something small, something that at first seemed like a mistake. The HOA patrol had walked up to our property line, pretending to check on some bushes near the sidewalk. But then, without asking, one of them leaned over the fence and started taking notes on a clipboard. Grandpa watched from his chair on the porch, his jaw tightening, as if every muscle in his face was trying to keep him calm. To most people, it wouldn't seem like a big deal, but for Grandpa, that fence meant something. He had built it himself, piece by piece, sweating under the hot sun years ago. It wasn't just wood and nails, it was a line of respect, a boundary that said, "This is my home, my ground, my space." And when someone crossed it without permission, they weren't just stepping on grass, they were stepping on his pride. Soon, it became a pattern. The patrol showed up week after week, acting as though the whole neighborhood was theirs to command. They peeked into yards, snapped pictures of garden tools left outside, and knocked on doors demanding answers. Grandpa called them the wannabe sheriffs because they strutted around like they wore badges of honor. But the truth was, they were just ordinary people with clipboards, trying to control others. My grandmother often tried to keep the peace. She would place her gentle hand on Grandpa's arm and whisper, "Let it go. It's not worth your blood pressure." But Grandpa never believed in letting things slide. He was old, yes, but his spirit was sharp as ever. He used to say, "If you give them an inch, they'll take your whole yard." And the way those patrol members were acting, he wasn't wrong. The worst moment came one afternoon when we actually caught one of them climbing over our fence. It wasn't even subtle. He placed his foot on the wooden plank, swung himself up, and dropped right into our backyard as if it was a public park. Grandpa's hand gripped his cane so tight, his knuckles turned white. I could see the storm brewing in his eyes. He stood halfway, his voice low and rough as he muttered, "Not again." I thought he might explode right there, but my grandmother rushed over, urging him to sit back down. She knew how easily his temper could flare. The patrol member didn't even look ashamed. He walked across the yard, glancing at the shed, the flower beds, and even the clothesline, scribbling on his clipboard like he had the authority to judge it all. When he finally left, climbing back over the fence with a smug look on his face, Grandpa sat in silence. But silence from him was never a sign of surrender. It was a sign of planning. That night, the porch light glowed softly while the crickets filled the air with their steady song. Grandpa rocked slowly in his chair, staring at that fence as if it had betrayed him. His eyes weren't angry anymore. They were steady, calculating. He didn't say much, but when I asked what he was thinking, he simply replied, "They've crossed the line for the last time." It wasn't a loud promise. It wasn't a threat. It was a vow. Right then and there, Grandpa decided he wasn't going to let them trample over his hard work and his dignity again. He was going to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The morning after that long night on the porch, Grandpa rose earlier than usual. I found him already in the shed, dusting off boxes and moving aside old tools he hadn't touched in years. The smell of oil and rust filled the air, and his eyes lit up the moment he uncovered a small power unit wrapped in cloth. To me, it looked like nothing more than a forgotten machine, but to Grandpa, it was the key to his plan. He didn't explain right away. Instead, he gave me a half smile and said, "Son, sometimes people don't learn with words. Sometimes they need a little reminder." For hours, he worked with the focus of a man half his age. He laid out wires, screws, and connectors on a wooden bench, humming softly as he checked each piece. I kept asking what he was building, but he only chuckled and said, "You'll see soon enough." It wasn't until he brought out the heavy roll of copper wire that I realized he was serious. "We're electrifying the gate," he finally declared, and I almost didn't believe my ears. I thought it was a joke, but the sharp determination in his eyes told me otherwise. Grandpa wasn't just fixing a problem, he was defending his ground. The work took the whole day. He measured the gate carefully, wrapping wires along the frame with steady hands. Every twist, every knot, every connection was done with the kind of precision that only came from years of experience. I watched him sweat under the afternoon sun, his shirt damp, his brow furrowed, but he never slowed down. At one point, Grandma stepped outside, shaking her head, telling him he was crazy. But Grandpa only winked and said, "Crazy gets results." By evening, the project was finished. The gate looked the same to anyone passing by, but hidden beneath the ordinary frame was Grandpa's little surprise. He tested it carefully, making sure it was strong enough to scare, but safe enough not to harm. Satisfied, he dusted off his hands, poured himself a glass of iced tea, and took his place on the porch. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky orange and pink, he leaned back in his rocking chair with the calm of a soldier who had set his trap. With a quiet grin, he whispered, "Let's see how they like it when they try me again." 2 days later, the patrol returned like clockwork, their clipboards in hand and arrogance in their stride. They marched toward our fence as if nothing had changed, laughing among themselves. One of them, the boldest of the group, climbed over with practiced ease, landing on the grass like he owned it. He strutted toward the gate, ready to unlatch it and let the others in. But this time, things were different. The moment his hand touched the metal, a sharp crackle filled the air. His smug smile vanished as a jolt surged through him. He yelped, stumbling backward, his clipboard flying to the ground. The other patrol members froze, their eyes wide, unsure of what had just happened. For a few seconds, the yard was silent except for the sound of Grandpa's rocking chair creaking gently on the porch. Grandpa didn't say a word. He simply sipped his tea and watched with that calm, knowing smile, like a general who had won a battle without lifting a weapon. The patrol scrambled back over the fence, muttering angrily but too shaken to try again. From that day forward, they never dared to cross our property. Grandpa's lesson was simple: respect the fence or face the shock. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing content. Don't forget to join our HD Stories family and stay tuned for the next jaw-dropping story. Imagine working your whole life to buy a peaceful ranch, only to wake up one morning and find your neighbors built a fence around your own land, locking you out like you don't even belong there. Now, most people would fight, argue, or even give up. But this man, he outsmarted the entire HOA with one move they never saw coming. And it all started with a single gate key. Marcus had always been the kind of man who believed in working hard for what he wanted. He grew up in the city, surrounded by constant noise, traffic, and the feeling that you were always being watched. For years, he dreamed about having a place of his own, not just a house, but land. Land where he could breathe, where he didn't have to worry about neighbors complaining about every little thing. After decades of saving and working long hours, that dream finally became reality. On the outskirts of town, tucked away from busy streets and suburban developments, Marcus bought himself a beautiful ranch. It wasn't flashy, but it was his. Wide open fields stretched across acres of grass. A small creek ran along the back, and from his porch, he could see the sunset paint the sky every evening. For Marcus, this ranch was more than property, it was freedom. But that freedom didn't sit well with everyone. Just down the road, there was a neighborhood governed by a strict HOA. They were known for being controlling, nitpicky, and always looking for ways to enforce rules that made life difficult for homeowners. While Marcus's ranch wasn't officially part of their community, the HOA members didn't like the idea of someone living nearby who didn't have to follow their rules. To them, Marcus was an outsider, a reminder that not everyone wanted or needed their authority. It started with small things. Marcus would receive letters, some politely worded, others not so polite, suggesting that he maintain the look of the neighborhood, even though his property wasn't within their boundaries. They complained about the way he parked his truck, about the color of his barn, even about the chickens he kept. At first, Marcus laughed it off. After all, they had no real power over him. But the HOA wasn't used to being ignored. When their letters didn't get the reaction they wanted, they escalated. Board members would drive by his ranch slowly, staring at him as if he was breaking some law. Neighbors whispered and gossiped about how Marcus was too different and didn't belong. Some even approached him directly, insisting he should voluntarily comply with the HOA rules to keep the area uniform. Marcus refused every time, standing firm on his rights. His land was his land, and no one could take that away. Or at least, that's what he thought. Then one morning, Marcus walked outside and froze in disbelief. Workers were hammering posts into the ground, stretching wire and wood as far as he could see. Overnight, the HOA had ordered a massive fence to be built, not just along the edges of their neighborhood, but wrapped tightly around Marcus's ranch as if to swallow it whole. His driveway was blocked, his land was boxed in, and he stood there watching strangers put up barriers around property he legally owned. It was more than just an inconvenience. It was an insult, a message that they thought they could trap him under their control. For Marcus, that morning was the day his peaceful dream turned into a battle he never asked for, but was ready to fight. Marcus stood at the edge of his driveway, staring at the freshly built fence like it was a prison wall. His blood boiled as he realized what had just happened. The HOA had gone too far. They hadn't just tried to push their rules onto him. They had literally locked him out of his own property. The only entrance he had was now sealed off by a shiny metal gate with a heavy lock. That morning, as he tried to confront the workers, they told him they were just following orders. Marcus demanded to know who gave the orders, and of course, it was none other than Richard, the HOA president. Richard wasn't the kind of man who hid his intentions. He loved control, he loved power, and he loved seeing other people bend to his rules. When Marcus approached him later that day, asking why a fence was suddenly wrapped around his land, Richard gave him a smirk that said everything. "This is for community safety," he explained, pretending it was about protecting the neighborhood. Then he leaned in and added, "If you want the key to the gate, you'll need to cooperate with us." Simple as that. Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A key? To his own property? It didn't make sense. He tried reasoning with Richard, even showing him the deed to his ranch. The paperwork that clearly proved his land was separate from the HOA. But Richard only shrugged. "Maybe on paper," he said, "but around here, we do things differently. Everyone follows the same rules, no exceptions." It was obvious that Richard didn't care about the law. He only cared about control. For the next few days, Marcus tried to stay calm, but every time he saw that fence, it ate away at him. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to be told he couldn't even freely enter his own ranch without asking for permission. Neighbors who were part of the HOA avoided eye contact when they saw him. Some even whispered behind his back, acting as though Marcus was the one causing problems. The isolation was heavy, but Marcus refused to give in. He knew getting angry and yelling wouldn't solve anything. That's exactly what Richard wanted. Instead, Marcus did something the HOA never expected. He started digging into research. Night after night, he went through county records, land surveys, and property maps. He wanted to know every detail about where his ranch began and where the HOA's land ended. The deeper he looked, the more cracks he started to see in their so-called authority. That's when Marcus found something that made his heart race. The fence that had been built around his ranch wasn't even on HOA-owned land. In fact, a good portion of it sat on property that didn't belong to them at all. And the biggest discovery? The only road in and out of the entire neighborhood, including the new gate they'd locked him behind, was actually sitting on a piece of land that was not under HOA control. Even better, that strip of land had quietly been listed for sale. In that moment, Marcus realized he didn't need to fight Richard with shouting matches or lawsuits. He could beat him with patience and strategy. While Richard and the HOA thought they had boxed him in, Marcus was already planning the move that would flip the entire game upside down. Marcus wasted no time. The very next week, He met with the county office and arranged to purchase the narrow strip of land that included the road and the gate the HOA had just built. It wasn't a huge piece of property, but it was the key to everything, literally. When the paperwork was finalized and the deed was in his hands, Marcus couldn't help but smile. The HOA thought they had trapped him, but now, the only way anyone could drive in or out of their precious neighborhood was through land that belonged to him. At the next HOA meeting, Marcus walked in calmly and set the deed on the table. Richard's smug smile disappeared the moment he realized what it meant. Marcus now owned the road, the gate, and the only access point into the community. From that day forward, if anyone wanted through, they had to go on Marcus's terms. The HOA had no choice but to back off. The same fence they built to box him in ended up being the very thing that gave Marcus complete control. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't play dirty. He simply outsmarted them. And that's how one man turned the tables on an entire HOA, proving that patience and strategy beat arrogance every time. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real-life battles where justice is served, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and stay tuned right here on HD Stories, where we bring you the stories that everyone else is afraid to tell. It started like any other quiet morning in my small desert town. The sun was low, the air dry, and I was out front repairing my fence when I saw two police cars pull up fast down the dirt road. My first thought was maybe something happened nearby, but as they stopped in front of my house and stepped out, something about them didn't sit right. Their badges looked off. Their uniforms didn't match. Still, they spoke with confidence, and one of them barked, "Sir, step forward. We have a warrant for your arrest." My heart dropped. Arrest? For what? I stood there trying to process what was happening. The woman next door came out, confused, holding her phone up to record. "What's going on?" she asked. I didn't know what to say. I looked at the paper one of the men was holding. It wasn't even official. It was a printed sheet from a homeowners association. My name was on it, but the words made no sense. Violation of community standards, it said. My voice shook slightly as I said, "This isn't real. You're not real cops." That's when the shorter one stepped closer, face hard. "You can come peacefully," he said, "or we'll make you." I could feel my anger boiling under my skin. I'd lived in this community for years. I'd paid every fee, followed every rule, but this homeowners association, this HOA, was run by a few people who thought they owned everyone. They didn't like that I stood up to them. They didn't like that I spoke at meetings when they tried to pass unfair rules. And now, it looked like they were trying to scare me. Fake cops, fake papers, fake authority. I took a deep breath, looked them straight in the eye, and said, "You have no idea who you're talking to." They didn't flinch. One of them smirked. "We'll see about that," he said, moving to grab my arm. My neighbor gasped. I stepped back. "You lay one finger on me," I said calmly, "and you'll regret it." He laughed, thinking I was bluffing. But I wasn't just some homeowner on the edge of town. I was the state attorney general. I'd seen corruption, I'd fought it, and I'd taken down people far bigger than a crooked HOA. But at that moment, I wanted to see how far they'd go. So I let them talk. Let them push. Let them hang themselves with their own lies. One of them pulled out handcuffs. I could see his hands shaking slightly. That's when I knew they were scared. "You sure you want to do this?" I asked. He sneered. "You bet." I nodded slowly, then said, "All right, but you might want to call your boss first." He frowned. "Our boss?" "Yeah," I said. "The one who sent you here pretending to be law enforcement." His face went pale. "What are you talking about?" I took a step closer, locked eyes with him, and said, "You're impersonating an officer. That's a felony." He froze. The other man looked at him, confused. My neighbor whispered, "Oh my God." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my badge. The real one. The golden reflection of the setting sun hit it just right. Both men's faces dropped. The tough guy who'd been talking big just a second ago took a step back. "Sir, we didn't know." I cut him off. "You didn't care? You thought you could intimidate someone. You thought you could fake authority. Well, now you're going to face the real thing." They looked like they wanted to run, but before they could move, my phone was already dialing the sheriff's department. "Yeah, this is Attorney General Cole speaking," I said. "I've got two men here impersonating officers. Send a unit now." The color drained from their faces. The woman recording whispered, "Oh, this is going to go viral." One of the fake cops started begging, saying they were just hired by someone from the HOA, that they didn't mean any harm. But I wasn't buying it. You showed up with fake badges, I said, voice steady but firm. You threatened to arrest a citizen. You meant every word until you realized who I was. And now you want forgiveness. I paused, looked down the long empty road, and said quietly, "That's not how justice works." Within minutes, real police vehicles appeared, their lights flashing red and blue across the golden dust. The two fake officers were handcuffed and read their rights, the real ones this time. As they were led away, one of them turned and said, "Please, sir, we were just following orders." I looked him in the eye and said, "That excuse has been used by cowards for centuries. Be better than that." He lowered his head and got in the car. The HOA president came storming down the road minutes later, red-faced and shaking. "This is a misunderstanding," she shouted. I walked up to her calmly. "You sent two men to impersonate police officers," I said. "You had them try to intimidate a resident into silence. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a crime." Her lips trembled. "I didn't know they'd go that far." I shook my head. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You thought no one would fight back. But I will. Not just for me, for everyone you've bullied." I could see fear in her eyes, but also something else, shame. Maybe for the first time, she realized how wrong she'd been. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I just said, "You'll answer for this in court." Then I turned away as the sheriff nodded at me respectfully. My neighbor was still standing there, tears in her eyes. "I can't believe they did that to you," she said. I smiled softly. "They didn't do it to me," I said. "They did it to themselves." That night, I sat on my porch, the desert wind moving softly through the grass. The sun was long gone, and stars stretched across the sky like tiny fires of hope. I thought about justice, about how easily power can be abused when no one's watching. I thought about how many people don't have the power to fight back. That's why I do what I do. Not because of the title, not because of the badge, but because people deserve to be treated with respect. Everyone does. The next morning, news had spread everywhere. The video my neighbor took had gone viral overnight. "Fake cops arrested by state attorney general" was the headline. People were cheering online, saying justice had finally caught up with corruption. But for me, it wasn't about fame. It was about reminding people that truth always finds its way through lies. It might take time. It might hurt. But it comes. Days later, the HOA board was investigated. Several members were charged with conspiracy and fraud. The community changed after that. People spoke up more. Neighbors helped each other. And every time I walked down that same dirt road, I saw something new in people's eyes. Not fear, but courage. Sometimes, the hardest battles we fight are the ones we never saw coming. And sometimes, justice isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet. It's standing your ground. It's saying no when everyone else stays silent. That day reminded me that power means nothing if you don't use it to protect the weak. So the next time someone tries to silence you, remember this story. Remember that even in the middle of nowhere, truth has a voice. You just have to use it. And that's how a simple morning in the desert turned into a story of justice, courage, and redemption. Because when people try to fake authority, they forget one thing. Real authority comes from doing what's right. If you felt this story, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with someone who believes in justice. And don't forget to subscribe to HD Stories for more powerful real-life tales that touch the heart. They thought they could erase his family's history by selling off the land that had been in his bloodline for over a century. They believed he would stay silent while they cashed in on his 1,500 acres. But what the HOA didn't know was that this man knew the law better than they did. And instead of losing everything, he found a way to turn the tables so hard that the same people who stole from him ended up losing their own homes. For Marcus, the land wasn't just property. It was his family's heartbeat. His great-grandfather, a freedman after the Civil War, had poured everything he had into those 1,500 acres. With his bare hands, he planted crops, built a modest home, and carved out a future when the world was stacked against him. Every fence post and every field carried a story. Marcus's father used to walk him through the rows of corn and whisper, "This is ours. Nobody can take this from us." Those words stayed with him, shaping his pride and responsibility as the next guardian of the land. Generations worked it, celebrated on it, and even buried loved ones under the shade of its ancient oaks. It wasn't dirt. It was legacy, blood, and memory. But that legacy was suddenly threatened when a homeowners association, newly formed in a flashy subdivision that had sprung up near his property, decided to interfere. The HOA was made up of people who had never known the land's history, people who saw Marcus's wide, open acres not as heritage but as an opportunity. On paper, they began calling the property abandoned. They whispered among themselves that nobody really lived there, that the land was just sitting unused, and that it would be better in the hands of developers. With a few shady signatures and backroom deals, they filed paperwork to sell pieces of it, ignoring the fact that Marcus had lived there his entire life. The first time Marcus realized something was wrong was when he saw strange trucks parked on his land. Workers were hammering posts, putting up temporary fencing, and acting like they had every right to be there. His children, who used to run free across those fields, now stared at the new barriers with confusion and fear. "Daddy, why are they putting up a fence in our yard?" his daughter asked. Marcus's heart sank. It wasn't just about property lines. It was about outsiders trying to erase everything his family had built. He confronted the men on his land, demanding answers, but they coolly told him to take it up with the HOA. So he did. Marcus went to the HOA board meetings, papers in hand, the original deed from the county courthouse, tax receipts, and proof of ownership that went back generations. But when he stood before the board, they treated him like he was invisible. One of the board members even smirked and said, "We don't see any valid proof here. Maybe you're confused." The words cut deep. It wasn't just the insult. It was the arrogance, the assumption that he had no voice, no power, and no claim to his own land. Marcus left that meeting boiling inside. They thought he was powerless because he was just one man against an entire board. They thought that because he was black, they could dismiss his claims and sweep him aside. But what they didn't know was that Marcus wasn't just a man clinging to memories. He was a man standing on generations of proof, law, and justice. And he wasn't about to let anyone steal what his family had bled for. Marcus knew that anger alone wouldn't win this fight. Storming into another HOA meeting or yelling at the workers on his land would only give them more reasons to paint him as the problem. What he needed was patience, strategy, and undeniable proof. So, he sat at his kitchen table night after night, pulling out every old folder, every box of records, and every piece of paper his father and grandfather had carefully kept through the years. He laid out tax receipts that showed his family had paid on the land faithfully for over a century. He found the original deed, its ink faded but still clear, stamped with the county seal. He even found letters from his grandfather, written in the 1940s, describing the harvest from those very same acres. To Marcus, these weren't just papers. They were the truth carved in ink, the kind of truth that no HOA could erase. But Marcus also knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. He needed someone who understood the law as well as he understood the soil beneath his boots. That's when he hired an attorney named Carla, a sharp, determined woman who had spent her career defending people whose land was wrongfully taken. When Marcus showed her the HOA's so-called sale documents, she shook her head in disbelief. The paperwork wasn't just sloppy, it was illegal. The HOA had no authority to sell his land, and the buyers had knowingly participated in fraud. Carla told Marcus something that gave him hope for the first time in weeks. They messed with the wrong man. We're going to take them apart in court. Together, Marcus and Carla built a case so solid it couldn't be ignored. They collected sworn statements from neighbors who had seen Marcus and his family working the land year after year. They dug up county records showing that Marcus's family had always been listed as the rightful owners. And they uncovered evidence that the HOA board members had pocketed money under the table from developers who wanted Marcus's land for expansion. The deeper they looked, the uglier it became. This wasn't just about one man's property. It was about greed and corruption that stretched across the entire neighborhood. When the first court hearing finally came, Marcus walked in with his head high. The HOA board sat across from him, looking smug and confident, as if they still believed this would all blow over. But as Carla presented document after document, witness after witness, the board's confidence began to crack. The judge's eyes narrowed with each new piece of evidence. What the HOA had done wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. The local news soon caught wind of the case. Reporters started showing up, filming outside the courthouse, interviewing Marcus about his fight. What began as a private struggle quickly became a public scandal. Neighbors who once dismissed Marcus started realizing the truth. The HOA wasn't protecting the community, they were exploiting it. And suddenly, people began siding with Marcus, offering support, and even digging up their own stories of being bullied or scammed by the HOA. For the first time, the board realized they weren't just fighting Marcus. They were fighting the truth, the law, and the entire community that was now watching their every move. Marcus wasn't just defending his land anymore. He was standing up for everyone who had ever been cheated by people in power. And with each court date, it became clearer the HOA's empire was crumbling, and their days of control were numbered. When the final ruling came down, the courtroom fell silent. The judge's voice was steady as he declared Marcus the rightful owner of all 1,500 acres. Every fraudulent deal, every shady sale, every false claim by the HOA was wiped away in an instant. Marcus had won back not just his land, but his family's dignity. But the victory didn't stop there. The court ordered the HOA to pay Marcus millions in damages for the years of stress, trespass, and fraud. The board members were personally liable, which meant their own assets were on the line. For many of them, that meant losing their houses, the very homes they thought their HOA would protect. One by one, the same people who had mocked Marcus now faced foreclosure notices on their doors. Neighbors who once whispered behind his back now shook his hand, thanking him for exposing the truth. Marcus stood tall on the land his great-grandfather once worked, knowing it was safe for his children and their children after them. Justice had not only returned what was stolen, but it had turned the tables. The bullies who thought they could erase a legacy ended up erasing themselves. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit like and share it with others. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next powerful story. This is HD Stories, where every story brings truth, justice, and hope. Imagine living peacefully on your own ranch, only to wake up and find your mailbox crushed over and over again. At first, I thought it was random accidents, but then I realized it was the so-called HOA cops from the neighborhood next door. They treated my land like it was theirs, but they didn't expect what I had planned next. I live on a quiet ranch just outside the city limits, where life is supposed to be simple and peaceful. My land is my pride, a place where I don't have to deal with anyone's rules but my own. There's no HOA out here, no board telling me what color I can paint my fence or how tall my grass can be. But right next to my property, there's a subdivision run by one of the strictest HOAs I've ever seen. They act like they own not just their neighborhood, but the land around it too. Some of the members even formed their own little group of patrol officers. They weren't real cops, of course, just a bunch of neighbors with badges they printed online, driving around like they had authority over everybody. And the road that runs along my ranch fence became their favorite route. At first, I didn't think much of it. I'd see their cars roll by, flashing their little lights, acting like they were keeping the world safe. But one morning, I walked outside and found my mailbox lying in the dirt. The post was split in half, the box itself crumpled like a soda can, and my mail was scattered across the road. My first thought was that maybe a delivery truck had clipped it by accident or some careless driver had misjudged the turn. Annoying, but things happen. I picked up the mess, hauled the busted pieces away, and put up a brand new mailbox. For a few days, everything seemed fine. But barely a week later, I woke up to the same sight, my new mailbox crushed and broken. The post was snapped again, my letters were soaked from the morning dew, and the box itself looked like it had been smashed with full force. This time, I started to wonder if it really was an accident. Still, I gave it one more chance. I replaced it again, thinking maybe lightning had just struck twice. But when it happened the third time, I knew something wasn't right. The pattern was too obvious, too deliberate. I began watching more carefully, and that's when I saw it with my own eyes. One of their so-called HOA cops drove past in his big SUV, swerved toward my mailbox, and hit it dead on. Instead of stopping, he laughed, sped up, and disappeared back into the neighborhood. That was the moment I realized this wasn't carelessness. This was harassment. They weren't just breaking my mailbox, they were sending a message. After seeing that SUV slam into my mailbox on purpose, I was boiling inside. I had always believed in handling problems calmly, but this was beyond disrespect. This was my land, my mailbox, my property, things I worked hard for. And here were a bunch of self-appointed HOA cops, treating it like a joke. Still, before taking matters into my own hands, I decided to try the reasonable route first. I went over to their neighborhood and asked to speak with a couple of their board members. I explained what I had seen, told them about my mailbox being destroyed again, and expected at the very least a serious apology. But instead of listening, they smirked like I was wasting their time. One of them even chuckled and said, "Well, maybe you shouldn't have put your mailbox so close to our road." That sentence alone made my blood run hot. Their road? It wasn't their road at all. It was a county-maintained public road that just happened to run alongside my ranch. They had no ownership, no control, and no authority over it. Yet they were acting like I was the intruder. I stood there, staring at their smug faces, realizing that they weren't going to lift a finger to stop it. In fact, they seemed to enjoy the fact that their little patrols could mess with me. That's when I decided I had to be smarter. If they thought they could push me around, they were about to get a lesson they wouldn't forget. I went home, sat down at my computer, and began researching. I read forums, watched videos, and even looked at local laws to make sure I was on the right side of things. What I came up with was a plan, not just to replace my mailbox, but to make sure it never got destroyed again. I designed a new mailbox, one that would look ordinary from the outside, just like any other box on a wooden post. But underneath, it would be completely different. I went to the hardware store, bought a heavy steel post, and had a section of reinforced steel casing cut to size. Then I dug a deep hole and poured concrete around the base, locking it solid into the ground. The steel post went right in the center, hidden by a wooden shell I built around it. On top, I attached a regular-looking mailbox so that anyone driving by would never know the difference. To the naked eye, it looked like the same old mailbox they had been knocking down for weeks. But in reality, it was built like a fortress. As I stood back and looked at it, I felt a surge of satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge, it was about standing my ground. If they tried to mess with me again, this time, the mailbox wouldn't give way. Their cars would. It didn't take long for my new mailbox to face its first real test. Less than a week after I finished building it, I was sitting on my porch one evening, sipping coffee and watching the sun go down, when I heard the familiar hum of an SUV engine coming down the road. My instincts told me it was them, the same self-proclaimed HOA cop who had been treating my property like his personal racetrack. Sure enough, as he got closer, I could see him swerving slightly, lining up his tires with my mailbox like he had done before. I tightened my grip on my coffee mug and waited. The moment came fast. With a sudden jerk of his wheel, the SUV veered off and slammed straight into my mailbox. But this time, the sound was different. Instead of the splintering crack of wood, there was a loud metallic bang, followed by the crunch of his front bumper collapsing in on itself. The impact shook his entire vehicle. His hood crumpled like paper, the headlights shattered, and almost instantly, the airbags exploded inside the cab. The man stumbled out, coughing and cursing, staring at the mailbox that stood tall and untouched, as if nothing had even happened. From where I sat, I couldn't help but feel a rush of justice. It was like watching a bully finally trip over his own tricks. Within minutes, the rest of his little HOA patrol buddies showed up, their cars pulling over in a frenzy. They circled around him, trying to figure out what happened, their faces switching between confusion and embarrassment. The mailbox stood there proudly, perfectly upright, not even scratched, while his SUV sat smoking on the side of the road. That's when I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff. When the deputy arrived, I calmly explained what had been going on for weeks. I showed him the video footage from my security cameras, which clearly caught the SUV intentionally swerving into my mailbox again and again. The deputy took one long look at the HOA driver, then at the wrecked SUV, and finally at me. He told me straight up, "You did nothing wrong. Your mailbox is on your property, and it's built legally. If they hit it, that's on them." Hearing those words felt like the weight of the world lifting off my shoulders. The HOA driver was furious, but there was nothing he could say. His laughter from before was gone, replaced with the reality of a repair bill that would cost him thousands. After that day, everything changed. The so-called HOA cops stopped driving past my ranch like they owned it. Nobody swerved toward my mailbox again. Nobody slowed down to mock me, and nobody dared to test the strength of what I had built. They realized they couldn't push me around. I didn't need to fight them with words or fists. I let their own actions backfire on them. Now, every time I walk out to get my mail, I see that same strong mailbox standing tall, and it reminds me of one thing. Sometimes, the best way to deal with bullies is to let them defeat themselves. If you love this story of standing up to HOA bullies, make sure to like, comment, and share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to HD Stories, because here, justice always finds its way.